Morning. Zoom is very, very slow today. I think everybody in the whole world is trying to get hold of their mothers to say Happy Mother's Day. Right, let's go. So we finished off at the end of the previous lesson, which I think was lesson 5. We ended off talking about the placenta, and I said that I would start this lesson talking about the actual structure of the placenta. So this is quite an important one. So let's go. Remember, firstly, it doesn't matter where the placenta is within the uterus. I told you that it could occur in a number of different places in the uterus. So here, the placenta is this part here, okay? And this drawing on the right-hand side is an enlargement showing more detail of the placenta. So what you can see here is you can see both maternal tissue on this side, and that obviously is the endometrium, the lining of the uterus, okay? And here, and I'm pointing down to stuff at the bottom, the muscle layer of the uterus. That's not an issue. Don't worry about the muscle layer. Do know about the endometrium. And then this part, the yellow part, is chorion. So let's talk about chorion, because that's the important thing. So when the placenta develops in the endometrium, it has got a number of chorionic villi. In other words, where it embeds into the endometrium, it embeds with many, many little finger-like projections called chorionic villi. And those chorionic villi, and you'll see them here on the drawing, those chorionic villi, just like you learned about the villi in the small intestine in grade 11, function to increase the ratio of surface area, which means this part, to volume of the chorion. Okay, so what they do, therefore, and they're full of blood vessels. We'll talk about the blood vessels just now. So what happens is nutrients and oxygen diffuse from the maternal blood into the chorionic villi, and carbon dioxide and waste substances diffuse from the blood vessels in the chorionic villi through the membrane of the chorion and back into the maternal blood. Okay, but I'll talk about that in more detail just now. Okay, so picture the alternative of the chorionic villi. Picture what would happen if there were no chorionic villi. So now I'm going to show you here. Imagine if the chorion was simply a structure like that without these chorionic villi. The surface area would be much, much smaller, and that would mean that the exchange of substances is far less efficient than it is with the chorionic villi. Okay, so remember the chorionic villi function to increase the ratio of surface area to volume for increased absorption of substances from the maternal blood and passage of substances from the fetal blood into the maternal blood. Okay. The second feature that is important is there are many maternal blood vessels in the endometrium. But what actually happens around the placenta is those maternal blood vessels break down, and therefore they form what is known as a maternal blood sinus. And that means that there's a pool of maternal blood surrounding the chorionic villi. So they are embedded in the blood liquid. They are surrounded by mother's blood, maternal blood. The chorion, being a membrane, prevents those two bloods from mixing. And that's very, very important, because it is possible that the maternal blood is of a different blood group to the fetal blood. In other words, let's say, for example, the mother is A positive and the baby is, I don't know, B negative. So what that would mean is, and I spoke about this last time, is that you know that people can't get a blood transfusion with blood that is of particularly different kinds of blood groups to themselves. Now, you don't know all the ins and outs of this whole thing, so it's possible to get a blood transfusion with some different bloods, but not others. It depends on what your particular blood group is. But here, it's terribly important that those two bloods don't mix. So the chorion prevents the mixing of the blood, and that's important. So this brings the maternal blood into close contact with the chorion, which enhances the uptake of substances from the fetal blood to the maternal blood, and from the maternal blood to the fetal blood, because there's close contact between the maternal blood and the chorionic villi. The chorion acts as a filter to a certain extent. I spoke about that last time, ensuring that most harmful substances, or many harmful substances, are not able to pass from the maternal blood to the fetal blood. So let's have a look at the actual blood vessels that are here. So this part here is an extension of the umbilical cord. It's the end part of the umbilical cord here. If you look at the drawing on the left, it's the end part of the umbilical cord. And then the umbilical cord obviously is long, and so it would extend all the way to the belly button, the navel of the baby, right from where the umbilical cord was produced. And if you look at it, it contains 3 blood vessels. You've got to be careful here. Do not confuse the blood vessels. Now remember, this is USA spelling, so they spell fetal F-E-T-A-L. You need to remember to spell fetal F-O-E-T-A-L, because you use UK spelling. I want to cough, sorry guys. Fetal umbilical arteries, and remember that artery is A for away, so it's going from the direction of blood flow in the fetal arteries is always from the heart of the fetus, down here, and it'll go along the umbilical cord. There are 2 fetal arteries, and they carry, this is very unusual, remember it only happens here, and it happens in the pulmonary arteries. The blood in the fetal umbilical arteries is deoxygenated. So it contains a low proportion of oxygen, low oxygen concentration, and very little nutrients, and it's high in waste substances such as carbon dioxide and nitrogenous waste substances, urea, uric acid, etc. So the umbilical arteries carry blood from the heart of, well, in terms of direction, but it's not from the heart in terms of, yes, it actually is. So from the fetus to the chorionic villi of the placenta. And it divides up to the umbilical arteries separate, and they divide up into a network of capillaries inside the chorionic villi. and then the capillaries rejoin. And by then, the blood is obviously oxygenated because carbon dioxide and nitrogenous waste substances would have diffused from the capillaries in the chorionic villi through into the maternal blood. And oxygen and nutrients would have diffused from the maternal blood into the capillaries. So the blood becomes increasingly more oxygenated, and therefore the blood going back again, so the direction of blood flow is this way in the red blood vessel. And the red blood vessels join, and they form a single large umbilical vein. And that umbilical vein, unusual, carries oxygenated blood back towards the fetus. So remember, 2 fetal umbilical arteries, 1 fetal umbilical vein. So obviously the umbilical vein is much bigger than the umbilical arteries. Okay, so important that you know and understand about the structure of the placenta, about the blood vessels, and also a really nice question would be something like, how is the structure of the placenta suited to its function? Remember, if you get a question which asks, how's the structure of something suited to the function? The first thing that you have to do is state what the function is, because otherwise your answer makes no sense at all. So here you would talk about the function being the exchange of substances between the blood in the chorionic villi and the maternal blood. Right, and then you would go into the whole many blood vessels, maternal blood sinus, large surface area in relation to volume, etc., etc. So that's a good question. Okay. Again, here, different view of the whole thing, nice 3-dimensional view. So this is the umbilical cord up here, and then the umbilical cord, 2 umbilical arteries, okay, carrying deoxygenated blood, divided into the many capillaries in the chorionic villi, and those many capillaries rejoin and form the umbilical vein, single umbilical vein, carrying oxygenated blood back towards the embryo. And what you can see really nicely in this particular picture is you can see the maternal blood sinuses. So you can see that the blood vessels have actually broken down in the endometrium, and the chorionic villi are completely surrounded by pools of maternal blood. And so there's close contact between the blood in the capillaries and the blood in the maternal blood sinuses. Okay, I showed you this slide before, but now it might make a little bit more sense. So this is tissue of the embryo. It was originally the embryo, and then remember that the embryo becomes the fetus as soon as it's approximately 8 weeks old, and it has recognizable human features. And it's no longer called an embryo, then it's called a fetus. However, do be aware that many people will still call it an embryo. And so what you can see here is there's the umbilical cord that would have connected to the baby's navel. And then this is how big the placenta is. And you can see many, many big blood vessels that divide into smaller blood vessels, or they might be the ones joining back up again. Right. So these 2 pictures just show, this one I know is an embryo 50 days old. I don't know how old this one was, but what you can see very clearly is the amniotic sac filled with amniotic fluid. Here you can also see the amniotic sac and the amniotic fluid, but you can also see the umbilical cord here. Right. this would be a cesarean birth, because what you can see here is they've removed the fetus from the woman's uterus, and it's still within the amniotic sac, so that you can see amniotic fluid here. Okay. So, in writing, the umbilical cord, and I must emphasize again, there's no H in cord, it's not a musical cord. So it's a cord that connects the embryo to the placenta in mammals. It contains a single vein and 2 arteries. So the arteries would be the blue ones, okay, and the vein would be the red one because of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. The 2 umbilical arteries carry deoxygenated blood with a high concentration of carbon dioxide and waste substances, and these waste substances and carbon dioxide, which is also waste, diffuse across the placenta and then would be excreted by the mother. So they go into the body of the mother, and the carbon dioxide would obviously, when it gets to the lungs, would pass out with the carbon dioxide that the mother had produced when she breathes out, and the nitrogenous waste substances would be filtered out by the kidneys and would then be excreted in the mother's urine. Okay, so she just passes out these waste substances together with her normal waste substances. The umbilical vein carries oxygenated blood rich in oxygen and nutrients that are diffused into the fetal blood from the maternal blood. We've spoken about the amnion being the membrane that encloses the embryo within the amniotic cavity. So this beautiful photograph shows the amniotic membrane, amniotic fluid, and look how long the umbilical cord is. You can see clearly in this picture that it actually, while I say attaches to the navel, in fact it is produced from the tissue in this area and extrudes from the body in that particular area. So there's the umbilical cord, and then here you can see the placenta on the other side. So the amniotic cavity is filled with amniotic fluid. Okay, I'm going to try and swap over to this particular animation, which is a really good animation that you must make sure that you watch, on the role of amniotic fluid. Try and swap over. Right. Easier said than done. Oh, no, how did that happen? Sorry. Okay. Swap.
Inside a pregnant woman's uterus is an amniotic sac, which contains amniotic fluid and the growing fetus. The amniotic fluid is important for several reasons. It helps keep the baby warm, and because his body parts are growing so fast, the fluid provides lubrication that keeps them from growing together. In some cases, fingers and toes can become webbed as a result of not enough amniotic fluid circulating in the uterus. The amniotic fluid also lets the baby move easily, so he can exercise his muscles and strengthen his bones before he's born. In addition, it acts like a liquid shock absorber for the baby by distributing any force that may push on the mother's uterus. Even sex won't hurt the baby. Amniotic fluid is 98% water and 2% salts and cells from the baby. Until the fetal kidneys start working during month 4, amniotic fluid is made by the mother's body. But after month 4, the little guy started making his contribution to the amniotic fluid by urinating in it. You heard right. It may not sound appealing to us, but the urine in the amniotic sac is completely harmless to the baby. The baby swallows amniotic fluid, which then passes through its digestive system, into his kidneys, and back out again to the amniotic sac as urine. In this way, he can practice using his digestive and urinary systems before he's even born. In fact, doctors can tell by the amount of amniotic fluid whether the baby has difficulty with his swallowing reflex. By the time he's born, he will consume up to 13 ounces of amniotic fluid a day.
Let's get rid of that one. Oh, no, how can I do that? Because I'm still going to go back, start share. Stress. Okay. So, going back to that. Okay. Right. So, let's go back. So, I hope that worked. So, the functions of the amniotic fluid that you have to know about are: it helps to regulate the temperature within the uterus, or in which the baby is, the fetus is actually suspended, provides lubrication that keeps the body parts from going together. And remember, I said, you saw in the animation, fingers and toes can actually become webbed if there's not enough amniotic fluid circulating in the uterus. It helps the baby's lungs develop. Lets the baby move easily. And when I say baby here, you should perhaps be putting in fetus or embryo, so that he or she can exercise the muscles and strengthen the bones before being born. It acts like a liquid. They always talk about shock absorber. Okay, it's not a term I like. So it protects the embryo or the fetus from mechanical damage. So it distributes any forces that may push on the mother's uterus. The baby swallows amniotic fluid, which passes through the digestive system into the kidneys and back out again into the amniotic sac as urine. And in this way, the use of the digestive and urinary systems is practiced even before birth. It protects the embryo from desiccation. Be careful how you spell this. It's not 2 S's, it's 2 C's and 1 S. Okay. And then you need to do the questions in activity 4.10 on page 80 of the textbook. Right, so that's the end of the structure of the placenta. I'm going to go back and just briefly mention again human chorionic gonadotrophin, or HCG, which is not to be learned. Remember, it is made by the placenta during pregnancy. This point is important, but you don't have to know it. It stimulates the ovaries to produce more progesterone, because remember, it maintains the corpus luteum. And that usually stops the menstrual cycle during pregnancy. It passes into the urine of a pregnant female and can be detected by a pregnancy test about 12 to 16 days after fertilization. It is thought that morning sickness is caused by the high levels of this hormone in the first 3 months of pregnancy. So you don't have to know about a pregnancy test, but you do have to know, no, you don't have to know, I'm just going to show it to you, that at this end, down at the bottom left here, what you can't see here is a little absorbing piece of paper, part of the actual structure of the pregnancy test. And when a female urinates on that absorbent paper, the urine, together with its hormones, is drawn up inside the pregnancy test stick in the paper. And what happens is there are little antibodies in here that respond to the human chorionic gonadotrophin if it is present. and then they would form this second line. So this line that shows naturally whether a woman is pregnant or not is just to show you that the pregnancy test is working. If a female is pregnant, then a second line will appear, a line will appear, a colored line will appear here. And that shows that the female actually is pregnant. And that second line is the result of the presence of human chorionic gonadotrophin in her urine, and it wouldn't be there if she wasn't pregnant. Okay. Right, so hormones controlling pregnancy, labor, and birth, and this is the second part of that. So progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum for the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. So it starts to decrease from week 10, remember, because the corpus luteum starts to deteriorate around about week 10. And from then on, it starts to be produced by the placenta. This is together with estrogen also from the corpus luteum and estrogen also from the placenta. But the estrogen is not the huge issue here. The main important hormone is progesterone. So if they ask you in the matric exam or a test or an exam, what hormone? Progesterone. Don't talk about estrogen unless you have to. And remember that what it does is it maintains the endometrium. So the endometrium is retained within the uterus and it's kept as very thick. And by doing this, it prevents a miscarriage. Another important hormone is oxytocin, and it is produced by the hypothalamus. It is stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So if you remember back to the section of work on the endocrine system, you learned that the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland does not produce its own hormones. The hormones that it releases are made in the hypothalamus, and they pass from the hypothalamus to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which then stores those hormones. So oxytocin, if you're talking about this in a test or exam, it is more accurate to say oxytocin is released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. If you say secrete, it sort of implies that it's made by the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and so I would prefer you to say it is released. And its functions are, it causes the contractions in the uterus. So those are labor pains. It dilates the cervix. So remember that the cervix is a sphincter muscle. In other words, it is a little circular set of muscles. And remember that the cervix was closed during the period of pregnancy to prevent the embryo or the fetus from falling out through the vagina. So in order for birth to happen, the cervix has to dilate. In other words, it has to get wider and wider and wider, and it should dilate to about 10 centimeters. Look at 10 centimeters on your ruler. That's quite a big dilation. And it's got to dilate that wide before birth can start occurring. Okay. So if a female's not going into labor and the medical caregivers need to induce labor, in other words, force her to go into labor, let's say she's gone over her time for a significant number of days, then they would use oxytocin. And then this one, which is unrelated to the actual labor, it stimulates the release of milk from the mammary glands when a baby is suckling, or sometimes even when a baby isn't suckling, but we'll talk about that. Okay, so remember that there's the pituitary gland, hangs down off the bottom of the hypothalamus, and remember it's got an anterior lobe, we're not interested in that at the moment. and the posterior lobe, we are interested in that one, and that the hypothalamus produces oxytocin, which passes down into the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland and is stored there. And then during the birth process, oxytocin passes into the blood and it is taken to the uterus where it stimulates the contractions of the uterus, and also to the mammary glands where it stimulates the release of milk when that is necessary. Okay, and then just for interest's sake, a hormone called relaxin. And relaxin is secreted by the corpus luteum and later by the placenta. And it softens the tissues and the ligaments during pregnancy. And it provides increased flexibility in the joints of the lower back and the pelvis in preparation for childbirth. Because remember that there needs to be a little bit of slackness in the joints of the pelvic girdle to enable the pelvic girdle to widen a little bit as the baby passes through during labor. I don't know if I should say this because it's not really relevant, but it's of interest because I didn't know that this could happen. My cousin has had 2 children, and her joints have not gone back to the original position. So she has a lot of back problems that have been caused by the fact that she secreted too much relaxin during her pregnancy. And so her joints haven't gone back to the position that they should have been in. So here she is 40 years down the line, still in pain as a result of having had babies. Okay, let's have a look at the next one. Prolactin, produced and secreted by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And this promotes lactation. So I think I'm going to stop at that point, and I will start again on this slide next time round. Okay, so going to, no, not.